Do you remember the promise? Within 18 months, a Justin Trudeau-led government would introduce electoral reform legislation, sweeping aside the first-past-the-post system we've used to elect our parliamentarians for 150 years. That was the bold election pledge made in 2015 that helped the Liberal Party make the case that they represented, quote, real change. And this week, that was the promise the government said it would not and could not keep. For a look at what happened, we welcome Caitlin Northam. She's an organizer for the electoral reform advocacy organization Lead Now, and Michael Taube, columnist for Troy Media and a contributor to the Washington Times. Michael, it's good to see you again. Caitlin, first time here. Lovely to have you on the program. Well, here's how it came down in the House of Commons this past week. The brand new Minister for Democratic Institutions delivering what you would certainly consider the bad news. Roll it.
Canadians have a range of views about whether to continue using the current first-past-the-post system to elect MPs to the House of Commons. We respect and thank all those who have come forward to participate in these discussions. It has informed our decision, and it has become evident that the broad support needed among Canadians for a change of this magnitude does not exist.
What we just watched was perhaps one of the most cynical displays of self-serving politics this government has yet to engage in.
Karina Gould, the minister, and Nathan Cullen, the British Columbia New Democrat, responding. Let's just start from the beginning here, shall we?
Sure.
With what she actually said, which is there's no broad consensus for changing the way we currently elect politicians. Is that true?
Well, look, I think that during the 2015 federal election, I think that people were more engaged in the issue because Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made it a major part of his policy plank. So his basic comment was that, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, that 2015 will be the last federal election where Canadians will ever have to deal with first past the post.
That's what he said.
And the real key here was that a lot of people, including a lot of young people, were very enthused by that statement because it was fresh, it was new, it was transformational. It was different than what Stephen Harper and the Tories, my old friend and boss, represented. So it actually sounded really good. The problem was very early on, the discussion sort of geared very quickly into what was the Liberals' chosen model, which was preferential ballots, which we'll discuss a bit more.
We shall.
It became actually the top choice out of the many, many different types of ER, or electoral reform models that exist right now. For that reason, I think a lot of people became very frustrated that the Liberals had showed their hand very early on. And for, say, conservatives like myself, who knew that first past the post has actually worked primarily to the advantage of the Liberals and a little bit to us as well, to see something that actually could have benefited the Liberals even more was absolutely frustrating to us.
Okay, Michael, what I did not hear in that answer anywhere was the minister is wrong. And therefore, I'm inferring that the minister is right. There's no consensus to change the current system.
I think that she may be in part correct. I think that a lot of people have become dissuaded by the issue of electoral reform. I think they like the idea in principle, but based on the way that the Liberals rolled it out, which I thought was actually pretty inept overall, I think that it has actually discouraged a lot of people from moving forward with it. It doesn't mean electoral reform is dead forever, but for right now and for the foreseeable future, it's just not an issue.
Caitlin, the promise came in the 2015 election campaign. Did you believe the Liberals would fulfill that commitment by the time their first term was done?
I mean, we always knew it was going to be an uphill battle. There's a lot at stake here for all of the political parties. But I do think that Justin Trudeau ran on a promise to be different. And he really went out and sold that, especially to young voters. And so, yeah, we were willing to take him at his word and engage in good faith with this process. And that's what we did. And that's why we're so disappointed to see, how things have turned out.
I appreciate the disappointment, but would you agree with the minister that there is no consensus in the country to change the status quo?
No, I don't.
You think there is a consensus?
I think that first of all, if you look at the process as it unfolded, and if you were following the committee process, you did see pretty close to consensus from the experts who testified before the all-party committee that proportional representation was probably the best option for Canada. You also saw at all of the consultations that went on across the country, the vast majority of people that went and spoke at open mic sessions also spoke in favor of proportional representation. So I think that it's pretty clear that there was, if not a consensus, there was certainly, we were going somewhere. We were going towards one system over another system. And that was not what the government wanted to hear. And so they're out there saying right now that there's no consensus, when in fact they didn't try to come to a consensus.
Well, that's a separate issue. Let me follow up on this. There certainly, as you describe it, appeared to be a consensus among those who deeply care about this issue and who made presentations to committees. That's not the general public in Canada. That's the people who deeply care about this issue. So again, is the minister accurate in saying there's no consensus among the general public?
So I think that it depends on the way that you phrase the question. I think that there is a low level of general literacy about voting systems in Canada, and that's partly because we're one of the few OECD countries, or the only OECD country and one of the few countries in the world that uses first past the post at every single level of government. So Canadians only know first past the post. So if you say, what do you think about this other system that you've never tried or used before?
I have no experience with
that.
that.
People have no experience with that. So, but I think if you were to say to people, do you think it's fair that a government should win 100% of the power with just 39% of the vote? I would guess that a lot of people would say, no, that's not fair. So I think it has a lot to do with how you engage Canadians on this question. I think a lot of the polls that were done on this issue did phrase it in a way that people would find difficult to respond to.
Michael, what I find fascinating here is that there seem to be, at least in the feedback that I'm getting, is many people who are less upset with the breaking of the promise, which they kind of never expected the Liberals to make good on in the first place, because it was going to be hard.
Yep.
But they're more upset about the fact that the Prime Minister, almost right up until he made the announcement that he was going to stand down on this, kept saying it's, he doubled down on the promise, even as he was, I guess, behind the scenes, figuring out a way not to do it. That's problematic, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it is problematic. You're absolutely right. Look, I'm one of the few conservatives you're going to find who actually supports electoral reform. I really do. Except for a very short period of my career, I have always been on side, and I've read Aaron Liphart, Giovanni Sartori. I actually know this issue really well.
Okay, no one knows who those people are.
Those are two academics who have written very heavily on different sorts of PR, or proportional representation models. But irrespective of that, I think that the Liberals really were in kind of an interesting situation. First past the post has always worked to their political advantage. 75% roughly of the federal governments we've had in this country have been liberal, and there's a reason why. The model works for them. The reason conservatives by nature don't really object to it is, although we haven't done as well naturally federally, that's only about 25% of the time, we do well on the provincial level with this model. Ergo, why would, if it ain't broke, why would we fix it to begin with? So if the Liberals lost this vote, which I don't think they really wholeheartedly cared all that much about, quite frankly. I think they basically did it as a little carrot dangling out as on the stick, and if the stick broke, well, that's life and we move on. If they had moved to preferential ballots, I think it would have benefited them even more. I've written about this. So if they lose that battle and they keep FPTP, which is first past the post, what does it matter? Because it's still to their advantage.
Well, one of the ways that certainly the Conservatives wanted to figure out where the consensus was on this was to have a referendum. The Liberals were loath to do that. What was your view on having a referendum to resolve this?
Yeah, I think that the referendum question became a bit of a proxy for the overall issue of how this did need some form of legitimacy from the public. I do think that a referendum is not the be-all, end-all of finding consensus or legitimacy. I think that they can actually be a really blunt tool, a really problematic tool for asking people what they really want. As we've seen with Brexit and with other recent referendums, they can become proxies for other issues. They can become quite divisive. So I think that the view of people who were involved in this movement was that it would have been better to go to another process like a citizens' assembly if we were looking to kind of forge some kind of consensus that was outside of the partisan system.
Well, here's how Campbell Clark in the Globe and Mail very succinctly laid it out. His conclusion was the NDP wanted proportional representation, Prime Minister Trudeau liked preferential ballots, and the Conservatives didn't want change. So that's a pretty clear indication that there's no consensus on this issue if these three different parties represent the differing views on Canadians.
Right.
Caitlin, would you have preferred a preferential ballot where when you go into the ballot box, here's who I want to come first, here's my second choice, here's my third choice, and so forth?
I mean, preferential voting can be appropriate in some contexts. So, for example, at the municipal level, but in this specific instance, it wasn't addressing the core thing that our community, the Lead Now community, was concerned about, which was this issue of false majorities. So, you would still see governments winning power, winning, almost absolute power without, the appropriate share of the popular vote. And I think that is really at the heart of why people wanted to move to proportional representation. So I don't think it was really solving the core issue.
What was your preferred option?
It was not that. I knew preferential ballots. I know them quite well, and I knew that was not to our advantage at all.
Our meaning?
Our meaning conservatives. We knew that would be one of the worst possible options for us.
Because it favors sort of big tent center parties.
Well, you also have to look at other studies as well. You have to look at what the second choice of most partisan supporters are. For the Tories, typically it is the Liberals these days because we don't really have anybody else. We have no natural allies in Parliament anymore. Even in the days of the break between the old federal progressive Conservatives and the Reform Party / Canadian Alliance, even if we were at each other's, we were fighting one another, we knew that there could be consensus on particular issues. Right now, we're all by ourselves. If you also look at other studies, for the Liberals, typically their second choice for welfare or left-leaning Liberals, it tends to be the NDP. For business or right-leaning Liberals, it sometimes is us, but sometimes will be the NDP, depending on the way the landscape kind of is attached.
Are you happy with status quo then?
I'm not happy with status quo, but status quo right now, as compared to the Liberals' decision to shift to preferential ballots, aside from all their commentary that they were going to discuss all these different electoral reform models and we were going to go through everything. Firmly, I don't believe that Marilyn Monsef was planning to do that.
The previous minister.
Yes, and I don't believe that Karina Gould, if she had been given the right, would have done it either. They had a plan. The plan obviously benefited the Liberals to the nth degree, and they lost it. But in the end, it doesn't really matter because they still have the system or a model that favors them, at least on the federal front.
One of the other, Caitlin, criticisms I've heard is that the Liberals, having made this pledge to bring in a new electoral system in time for the next election, then did not do what you perhaps should have done, which is essentially educate the public on what those options are. They essentially said, okay, you guys at a committee, you figure it out. We'll put this mydemocracy.ca thing out there, which was, just pilloried from the beginning because it seemed to be such a dog's breakfast of stuff. Should the government have undertaken some kind of education campaign to get Canadians more engaged on the issue?
Yeah, absolutely. There was no reason why they couldn't have done that. They had all the country's experts at their fingertips. They have, a lot of resources. They could have taken the money that they put into the My Democracy survey and put it towards a pretty substantial public education campaign. And I did hear that there was concern about doing that because they were worried that it would seem like they were biased one way or the other, which I just think is a bit of a cop-out. I think that they could have also leaned quite heavily on Elections Canada, which is full of people with tons of experience educating people on exactly these issues, and they didn't do that. So I'm sort of at a loss as to how they can go out now and say that they just couldn't find consensus.
Well, and the new minister now says that one of the prime things that her responsibilities will focus on is making sure the Canadian political system is safe from cyber threats and cyber hackers. What's your view on that?
Yeah, it's good to make sure that our system is safe. We've definitely seen the consequences of that, in the States. But I think that it's a distraction. I think that they're trying to change the channel from this as soon as possible.
And the second thing she says she's supposed to look at, based on her mandate letter from the Prime Minister,
yes,
is new legislation governing political fundraising. A worthy goal in your view?
Well, based on the trouble they've recently had with both the Aga Khan and Chinese businessmen, yes, I would sort of say there might be some legitimacy to that. I think people want to have more openness and transparency in their government, and the pay-to-play model, which basically means you're paying the entry fee, whatever it costs the dinner, to get more access or greater access to a political leader, or in this case, the Prime Minister. Even if that's not the case for each dinner, meeting, conference, etc., it has the illusion of that. And for that reason, I think it frustrates a lot of Canadians.
So worth doing.
It is worth doing because even a lot of Liberals realize that even if, for example, Justin Trudeau and the Aga Khan have had a relationship since he was a little boy, they accept that as being the case. But you can't do it when you're the leader of the country because it just looks bad when you go to his private island.
Well, one does have to ask now whether electoral reform, which it felt like stood the best chance of happening as a result of the Trudeau promise a year and a half ago, whether it's now dead. Is it dead?
I think that this is an idea whose time has come. I think that what we are walking away from from this process is much more public awareness of electoral reform than previously existed. I think that that leaves us in a really good position to continue building from the grassroots and continue putting pressure on governments to make this happen. I think that we're also, we're in pretty volatile political times. And I would argue that there's no better moment to sort of go into the business of trying to make sure that our democratic institutions are as strong as possible.
Well, that's fair enough. But, I note that Thomas Mulcair, the leader of the NDP, I think he's done the math on this. Mm-hmm. He said 1,813 times the Liberals mentioned that they were promising to change the electoral system.
That's right.
So that is that's a fairly significant number of times the public was reminded of this promise, and now the promise has been broken.
Yeah.
You can argue about whether it was for good or cynical reasons.
Yes.
Do you think politically the Liberals will pay a price as a result of breaking this promise?
Yeah, I haven't counted like Mulcair, but I'll take his word for it. 1,813 times is a lot. There's no question about it. But let's put it this way, if there's going to be a gravedigger and we put electoral reform in that, 6 feet under, I think that's where it's going to be for the time being. I just don't think that electoral reform has the interest or the appetite right now amongst Canadians, certainly for the next federal election, which will be 2019, and for the foreseeable future.
But does Trudeau lose votes over this?
I don't know if he necessarily will. Will it cost him being prime minister? No, I certainly doubt it. I think there's lots of other things that he's doing that I'm not terribly happy about that will cost him in the end if he does lose the next time out.
See, that's the thing I hear, is that for the people who really cared about this issue, this is a deal breaker, their hearts are broken, they'll never vote for him again. But how many people is that?
I mean, I would argue that this is not just about electoral reform. I think this is a part of a bigger story that we're starting to see unfolding about the Trudeau government not living up to the way that they sold themselves in the last election. So especially among sort of the red, orange, or NDP Liberal swing voters, and among young voters who may have voted for the first time ever in the last election and tended to vote for the Liberals. So I mean, you see things like this government not following through on their commitments to Indigenous peoples. They've approved pipelines that we know are not popular among young people. And I think that this, coupled with all of those things, is starting to build a story that, this government wasn't serious about doing politics differently.
Having said that, Michael, I wonder how precious the NDP should allow itself to be right now, insofar as when Paul Martin was Prime Minister, the NDP held the balance of power in a minority parliament. I don't think they ever once said, our support is contingent upon you changing the electoral system.
No.
Similarly, when your boss was in power with 2 minority parliaments, and they held, I think, almost all the balance of power.
Right.
They never once said to Stephen Harper, you know what, you want us to vote for your stuff? We need electoral reform. So
Right.
where do they get off right now saying, heavens to Betsy, you guys have deceived us and we're horrified over it?
Well, because people just don't like that. I agree with Caitlin that electoral reform is not dead, not by any means. I just think that right now it's on life support, and I think you have to be fair about it. But you're right. I mean, obviously, when governments get into power, they act very hypocritically in terms of whether they do or do not believe in electoral reform. The NDP provincially has certainly done that, and even federally, as you say, when they were in a position where they could have really pounced on it quite a bit, they chose not to. Because, quite frankly, politicians and governments reach a certain type of comfort zone where they're actually happy. And if the system, even if they think it's flawed, is working to their political advantage, why would they cut and run? Why would they bother to change it? They're happy where they are, and they want their mandate for as long as possible. So if the system is working to their advantage, they're going to play it out.
We got a minute left here, Caitlin, and I want to put this headline up here because if you didn't read Andrew Coyne in the National Post on this a couple of days ago, you really should. Here's the headline. It's not the Liberals' fault for lying about electoral reform. It's yours for believing them.
Yep.
Now, he's actually, if you read the piece, not blaming Canadians as much as the headline would suggest. He really is taking a real tough shot at the Liberals here for, in his view, cravenly and cynically failing to fulfill their commitment on this one. But did you just believe a little bit too much that this was going to happen?
You know what? I think that we engaged in good faith with this government on this promise because I think that, as I've said before, that we're at a time when we really need our political leaders to behave differently. And I think that, as I believe Andrew Coyne's point was, it's not our fault for wanting to trust that our leaders are going to do what they say they're going to do. It's their fault for not following through on those promises. So I think that, I'm proud of the way that we engaged with this government on this. We participated in their process, as flawed as it was, and really tried hard to help them come to a resolution on this, and they were not willing to try to find a way forward.
Will you work to defeat them in the next election now?
I can't say right now about exactly how we're going to approach the next election. Obviously, this changes a lot of things, but I do think that they are going to have to think really carefully about the impact that decisions like this are going to have on young voters.
That's Caitlin Northam. She's with Lead Now. They were responsible for the strategy and digital tactics on electoral reform. And there's Michael Taube, whom we all know from his pieces in Troy Media and the Washington Times. Good of both of you to join us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.